there, Levi here at Realize Homestead, just hanging out in our hoop house. Super bright and hot in here, but it's not a bad space because got all these lovely plant babies that Penny has planted and is growing for her CSA behind me. So I recently finished this book here, Overshoot by William R. Catton Jr. And the subheading here is the ecological basis for revolutionary change. But basically it has some, I think, really important ideas and concepts to help us understand natural systems, and specifically Catton is a sociologist by trade, and so he's able to analyze our society from an ecological perspective, and he gains a lot of really interesting insights about our past, and then especially about our future, that I think are really valuable and important for everyone to understand and know. So I thought I'd walk through some of that today. But yeah, just a little bit of background here. These all these wonderful plant babies in the background are being grown by Penny Kriebel with her OKCSA, who we're partnered with at Realize Homestead. Those are edible cut and come again, like lettuce and spinach there. And then these here are transplants that we're going to be planting out in the gardens like very soon. Actually, we've been doing the transplants because now we're into early June, and that's we're definitely past the last frost day. So all this stuff is getting planted out and moved out. But anyways, in here I've got the reason I'm in here now is because we got this nice marker board set up, and I've laid out a lot of these concepts and ideas here on the marker board. So alright, so here's a big idea. Yeah, it's really hot in here. I had to shut the fan off because it's too loud when I'm recording this, but I'll turn that back on in a minute. But anyways, one of the central concepts in this book, Overshoot, is this pattern that Catton really identifies and focuses on, that can be shown or described by this graph right here. So I'll kind of walk through this and explain all the different elements of what's going on, and also show how it applies on many different scales to many different organisms. This pattern seems to manifest itself over and over again all throughout natural systems and at many different scales. So, from the global scale down to just the animal scale like us, and even on down to the microscopic scale. So when you see this population, that could be the population of humans, or it could be the population of Arctic lynx, or it could be the population of yeast cells. So one of the first ones is carrying capacity, and not everyone is familiar with that term. It's a very ecological, a little bit jargony term, but essentially carrying capacity is how many individuals of a given species can the land or can a habitat support? How many can it carry? What is its capacity? And that's a quantifiable number, and it's based on how many resources are available for that organism and how many it needs to sustain its population or support itself. So that's the first concept, carrying capacity. Now the second concept that is starting to get into the story of what typically unfolds in natural systems. So typically in a given environment, the population of a species starts out low, let's say, and if it's below the carrying capacity, then it will grow faster and faster at actually an exponential rate. So that's shown right here. So population is below the carrying capacity, typically leads to exponential population growth. And I'll get into these other ideas in just a minute. So you can see that on the graph right here. So the population is growing exponentially because essentially the resources are abundant and life is good. So for the Arctic lynx, this would be a situation where there's just snowshoe hares just running amok all over the place, and it's really easy for them to just catch everything they need and have what they need because their population is low and the snowshoe hare is high. And so that period of exponential growth, Catton terms it the age of exuberance, and he's specifically now focusing on human culture because this has implications for human society and kind of like the myths that we believe about life and about ourselves. So a lot of the myths that underlie U.S. culture typically come from this age of exuberance here. And in Catton's analysis, the age of exuberance roughly was around like the soaring 60s, so 1960s. So this is, after World War II. We won the war, hooray. We discovered atomic energy. Oh my God, that's amazing. We can do anything. We landed some people on the moon. Holy crap. It seemed like anything was possible and life was good. And this is sort of like where the American dream had its birthplace, and this idea that, we can all aspire using our great human ingenuity. We can aspire to a high standard of living and enjoy a high standard of living. And all the problems of the world are simply technical engineering problems that we can solve. So it was a very hopeful time. There was a lot of exuberance. And I also think that to tie this into current politics and current ideas, that's also probably where this idea of making America great again maybe has some of its roots, is for those who lived through the age of exuberance when resources were aplenty, and both monetary resources and also just food and materials and all that opportunity. And that's mostly a function of the fact that there were a lot of resources, and the population was lower than the carrying capacity at that time. But our population has continued to grow exponentially. And so what typically happens in these systems is that the population doesn't usually just level off right at the carrying capacity. Usually what happens is the population overshoots the carrying capacity and goes into a phase of drawdown. So this is where the population of organisms is actually depleting the resources depleting the resources that would otherwise sustain future generations. So that means that they're actually decreasing the fundamental carrying capacity of the land. So to go back to the Arctic lynx story, so this would be where all of a sudden the population of Arctic lynx has shot way above the number that can be supported by the underlying population of snowshoe hares. And so they're actually hunting and eating so many hares that the hares aren't able to reproduce themselves quickly enough. And so the underlying population of hares, it actually goes down, and that landscape, at least for a time, can't even sustain the original number of Arctic lynx that they could have. And so that, in effect, will lead to massive scarcity. There will be a lot of starving lynx during this period, and their population will inevitably go down. And then eventually the Arctic lynx population will get so low that it'll finally, the snowshoe hares will be able to recover a little bit, and they'll go into this sort of finding equilibrium, sort of like a wave, and eventually, in theory, they'll find some equilibrium, or it'll just keep going up and down and up and down. And that's exactly what has happened in the scenario of the Arctic lynx and the snowshoe hare, that their populations have been tracked, and they essentially track together in time. So that's an example of where overshoot, which is of course the name of the book, which essentially means the population has gone over the carrying capacity of the land. It can potentially lead to three different scenarios. And the first one I just talked about was population crash. The Arctic lynx population just crashed because there wasn't enough food, there wasn't enough prey for them. But there's a couple other ways that animals can respond in that situation. One of them is through migration. So the Arctic lynx, if they had the option, they could simply migrate to a different region, maybe where the snowshoe hares are still abundant, and they could continue that exponential population growth for a time. And in Catton's analysis, that's essentially what happened in Europe. Europe, the landmass of Europe, back in, say, the 1400s or so, had gotten close to, or even perhaps overshot, its carrying capacity for humans. And so that was causing a lot more conflict and scarcity, and people weren't happy. And there was a lot going on at that time, of course. A lot of other things, religious persecution and so forth, and tyranny and so forth. But basically this overshoot in Europe led to human migration from Europe to the Americas, and there was already of course, humans living in the Americas, but they were living much below the carrying capacity of the land at that time. And then the Europeans came and they just started, reproducing like crazy, and our population now has been just exploding in the Americas. But that's one response. It's not, a long-term solution, but it can work for a little while until you run out of places to migrate to, which seems to be what's happened with humans now. There's no new world, there's no new second hemisphere of the planet to discover and expand into to continue our exuberant population growth. So then there is another possible outcome of overshoot, and that's a term that Catton called phantom carrying capacity. And so this concept is basically where you temporarily inflate the carrying capacity through drawdown. So essentially drawing down the underlying resources that the carrying capacity is dependent on, allows that exponential population growth to continue for some time. And there's actually a really good example of that. There's a process that was developed around 1900 called the haber-bosch process. And it was revolutionary in its time because it was a new way of producing nitrogen fertilizer for the soil by pulling it out of the air. Most of the air is made from nitrogen, but the problem is for plants to grow, you need nitrogen in the soil. But the problem is it's not super easy to just pull the nitrogen out of the air and into the soil. Plants do it, certain plants like the legumes. But to do it on an industrial scale, it takes a lot of fossil fuel energy use, specifically natural gas. But they developed this process and it became super popular because it allowed us to increase our agricultural productivity of our land by 4 times, which is, enormous. It's incredible, actually. And now that's still the process that we kind of are depending on for producing our food. So that's a good example, though. But the problem here is that, of course, natural gas or fossil fuels are non-renewable resources. So they're not going to last indefinitely. They're not being renewed. So that means at some point we can't continue to use this method of inflating the carrying capacity. So this allows us to inflate the carrying capacity of the United States, for instance, by approximately 4 times. So on this graph, if this was the real sustainable carrying capacity, the phantom carrying capacity generated by the haber-bosch process would be, 4 times higher than that. So that'd be like, I don't know, up here or something. And so that's allowing our population, instead of just crashing back down or moderating back down, it's allowing our population to continue this crazy exponential growth up to this phantom carrying capacity. Some of the most optimistic estimates of natural gas reserves show that extraction will peak around 2050. So that's not very long from now. And actually more sober estimates, I guess I would say that the peak of natural gas production or really extraction is around 2025. So that means if we no longer have the cheap available natural gas to make our agricultural fields that much more productive, but our population has increased to depend on that, then what happens? Either we need to find a more sustainable way to maintain that productivity, or we need to moderate our population back down underneath the sustainable carrying capacity of the land, not depending on this. Now, there is some big potential to keep this kind of agricultural productivity and potentially even increase it more through new techniques, through new ecological-based farming techniques such as agroforestry, polycultures, no-till systems, cover crops. So fundamentally, a permaculture type of agricultural system can be more productive because you're growing in 3 dimensions. I guess I can draw this really quick. So a typical a typical agricultural field, you're essentially growing crops in 2 dimensions, because let's say this is a cornfield. So this, you just have one big field of corn like this. But if you start using a stacked polyculture system, then you can keep a lot of this here, but then also by doing tree crops like that, you can use more of this 3-dimensional space here and here, you know, and up here. Yeah, you lose a little bit of the productivity down in here, but oftentimes this overall system can be a lot more productive than simply the monoculture by itself. But that's still a very new thing, and not very many farms are doing that, and we need a lot more research to be done on it, but also a lot more application of these approaches. Because that's one of the ways that we can stop being dependent on fossil fuel, but maintain that incredible agricultural productivity that we've developed through our industrial methods. So that's an example of phantom carrying capacity. So essentially, actually using the permaculture farming methods, we could in fact increase the sustainable carrying capacity. It would be a permanent increase of the carrying capacity of the land, and that's what's so powerful about permaculture and about, you know, agroforestry and ecological agriculture, ecosystem restoration, is that we can fundamentally change and increase the productivity and the carrying capacity of our land base. So I think that's got huge potential. But it doesn't really solve the underlying problem that Catton is getting at, because again, even if we increase the carrying capacity in a sustainable fashion using, you know, these wonderful agricultural, eco-agricultural methods, it's almost a given that a population of organisms will just continue to grow exponentially until it overshoots that limit. And so typically populations are moderated by hitting, populations of organisms are moderated or managed because they run into resource limits. They run into some sort of limits in their environment that manage their population. Otherwise they would just continue to grow and grow and grow and grow. And that's just a fundamental survival instinct or survival mechanism that's built into organisms that allows us to proliferate and to survive. You know, the world is harsh, and the world is essentially out to kill us in a way. So what better way to try to continue to survive than to just grow, just reproduce and reproduce rapidly. Now there is an exception to this pattern actually that I just described that you might have heard of. It's called the demographic transition, and this has been shown to happen in most developed countries, where gradually, so in most developing, quote-unquote developing nations, their birth rate far exceeds their death rate, and so their population grows at a really fast rate. But as nations become developed, they go through this demographic transition where their birth and death rate tends to level off, and the population tends to level off. And that has more or less happened in the US. And actually they go on to show how it actually starts to decrease at that rate, and then economists start to worry, oh, if the population's slowly decreasing, what are we going to do? So, but the economists would generally say, you don't need to worry about overpopulation and overshoot, as long as we're able to get everyone in the world, get the whole world population into a developed, you know, to help lift them up into a sort of a developed standard of living or developed way of life, a developed nation, then the problem will solve itself because of this demographic transition. But you've probably read this by now, but the underlying problem that I see is that there's not enough resources out there to support all people on the planet to have our standard of living. And this is something I got from like some pop science article, but basically if everyone on Earth had the ecological footprint of the average US citizen, we would need 4.1 Earths. So clearly that is not sustainable, and that's not going to be a fundamental solution to this pattern here for the human population. One other thing I wanted to point out too is that, to use a microbiological example, this pattern also happens every time you ferment grape juice to make wine or beer or something like that. Because this population could be the population of yeast, and the carrying capacity is determined by the amount of sugar in the grape juice. And so, there's so much sugar in the grape juice, the population is growing, it's going crazy, everyone's happy, the yeast cells are all exuberant because, wow, look, this is a wonderful place we're living. It's full of sugar. So they go crazy, and they grow their population like mad. But then eventually, they consume pretty much all the sugar, and now their population is enormous, but there's not any more sugar, so then their population crashes. And also what happens in that situation is they create an environment that's too toxic for them to continue living as well, and that's the byproduct of their digestive system, which is alcohol. And of course that works out for humans because we love to drink their byproduct of converting that sugar into alcohol. But for them, it's kind of tragic because their population essentially crashes and dies of poisoning itself of its own byproduct. So, a good lesson, again, that humans should try to avoid, over-consuming the resources of our planet, which is kind of like a petri dish or like a flask of grape juice. The planet is a hard limit. It's not really reasonable to think that we could go outside of Earth to harvest the resources from other planets. Not in anywhere near the same way we do it on Earth. So we need to figure out how to manage the resources and manage our population on this planet, in this petri dish, without destroying it, without over-consuming and over-polluting it. So some of the conclusions here, some of the takeaways that Catton is getting at in this exploration of ideas, or in this analysis, is that this is a perennial human problem. This is always going to be around. It's not just a human problem. You could say it's an ecological problem. So it's important that we learn to understand it and take it into account when we're planning for the future and when we're looking at and analyzing the past and what has happened. And especially, our concept of, or our vision of what future we want to live, or what type of future is possible for us. The American dream, as it was conceived during the Age of Exuberance, is not going to be possible for our population in Overshoot. There's just not enough resources to sustain that population at our standard of living. So that means that we in the developed nation actually need to scale back and live more modestly, live more within our means and within the carrying capacity. Another takeaway is, it would be a great idea to approach, figuring out how to approach these ecological agricultural systems so we can not be dependent on fossil fuels for our agricultural productivity. Another one is avoiding the temptation to blame subgroups and ideologies. And you see this a lot, The economy kind of sucks now. So let's say that in the US we're in a period of overshoot now. Times are harder. It's not as wonderful as it was back in the Age of Exuberance. So there's a tendency or temptation to blame political ideologies or economic ideologies or different subgroups, immigrants or whatnot, for the increase in conflict and scarcity that we're experiencing, I think, on a global scale now. But it's important to try to avoid blaming subgroups and subdividing ourselves, and realizing that we're fundamentally all in this together, and we're all feeding into this problem to some degree. So we need to approach it and address it in a unified way. But when I say in a unified way, I'm not talking about central population control, because I think history shows us very clearly that does not work out well. And if you look at China as an example, who've instituted the one-child policy, has really devastating effects, specifically for female children. Anyways, you can look into that. So that means that an important solution is education and awareness, getting more people aware of this pattern and responding preemptively, because so this happens to many organisms all throughout nature and all natural systems, big and small. But humans are perhaps the only organism that have the awareness to understand it and respond preemptively to avoid some of the more catastrophic consequences of this. So when I talk about managing the population, it might sound harsh or mean to talk about like limiting children or something, like everyone should have the freedom to choose how many children they have. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Totally. But at the same time, if we are going to be compassionate and care about our children and our children's children, then it's important that we get across this idea that there are limits on this planet and in any region, and to be aware of this ecological pattern that has manifested itself all throughout nature, and realize that that pattern still applies to us humans. So we have maybe a responsibility to future generations to not draw down their resources and lead to some terrible collapse, but to manage ourselves and to find a balance, find an equilibrium without having to go through all this chaos of the up and down and up and down. I think that's the main idea. You know, it's not a super hopeful perspective, I guess, because, you know, the window is already closing. You know, he makes a very convincing case that we're already in this period of overshoot, and we're not even here. We're like way up here, you know. So there's a lot that needs to be done to manage this situation in a way that will cause the least amount of conflict and suffering. But first of all, we need to realize that the conflict that does exist, a lot of the conflict, is not because of different subgroups and religions or political ideologies. It's just the fundamental underlying ecological context that we live in right now that, you know, applies to all living things. So there's no, you know, don't feel guilty about it. That's just what happens to organisms, and we have to kind of go a little bit out of our way. We have to really be intentional to avoid this. If we don't think about this stuff, if we don't intentionally change our patterns and our habits, then just instinctively, if just going by our normal instincts or natural patterns that are built into us as organisms, then we are going to probably experience overshoot and crash, and eventually finding equilibrium, maybe, if we don't cause too much damage that the carrying capacity can't recover for many generations. So I think this is really important stuff. I hope that you found something interesting and useful in these ideas, and if you have any thoughts or ideas or critiques or feedback about this, then I invite you to please, you know, share some comments. I guess that's all for now, but it's lovely getting to share this crazy world with y'all and go on this ride. So let's try to do it thoughtfully. Take care.